For a time, the Kolkata Knight Riders fans were on a journey. The season wasn't going their way and they wanted a change at the top. And they were letting everyone on social media know about it.
This is the last knock. My dad refuses to tell me what this means.
And when you let people on social media know about it now, apparently the press also write articles about the same thing. And so you saw headlines like, captaincy questioned by fan. And a few days after that it was, furious KKR fans want to replace the captain after another defeat. And a short while later it was reported with, angry KKR fans also want a new leader. In the space of 2 weeks, you could just see the escalation from, questioned to angry. And even though this started with angry tweets, it seemed to get so loud, and maybe after the articles were written, and suddenly Kapil Dev is involved and he's talking about the leadership of Kolkata. And then Brad Hogg, a former Kolkata player, is then talking about the leadership of Kolkata. It becomes this cycle. Of course, then people start to report about what Brad Hogg and Kapil Dev have said, and the tweets keep going, and there's a lot of pressure at that point on the captain's job for Kolkata. And quite rightly, you would probably be thinking about Eoin Morgan right now. But those headlines that I'm talking about, they are not about Eoin Morgan. They are about Dinesh Karthik. They are from last season, not this season. Less than 12 months ago, Kolkata fans took to social media to demand that Dinesh Karthik was sacked and he was replaced by Eoin Morgan. Like 6 months after that, in the following season, they were demanding that Eoin Morgan be sacked. Yeah, Eoin Morgan's leadership is elevated in England because he won a World Cup. And it's not just because he won a World Cup, it's because he won a World Cup for England, and England had been absolutely rubbish at white ball cricket, almost from the period where we started playing it with a white ball. They had been comically bad for a long time, and then you have this sort of Dublin middle order outsider who likes the IPL coming in and going, do you know what, guys, I think if we just whack the ball a little bit more, we might be able to have some success. And they did. When Nick Holt and Steve James wrote a book about England winning the World Cup, it was called Morgan's Men, the inside story of England's rise from the Cricket World Cup humiliation to glory. It wasn't just Morgan, obviously. Andrew Strauss played a role in planning, in changing mindsets, in allowing players to play IPL cricket, but also just putting the white ball front and centre. Trevor Bayliss was England's coach, and he's obviously a white ball coach. That's kind of what he is known for as much as anything else. He was always going to be good at that, and he also said that the players should go and whack it. Nathan Lehman, and not just Nathan Lehman, but the whole sort of England analytics setup was more mature by that point. They didn't just have like the coach's ear, they had the players' ears, and everyone was involved, and they were part of the planning for this going ahead. But in cricket, we have devised a sport that gives the captain extraordinary rights on the field. Like, outside of cricket, there are a few other sports that have a position similar. Maybe the quarterback in American football is one. Quarterback still listens to the coach quite a lot and follows their plays. In cricket, a lot of it is just kind of off the top of your head. You can't communicate correctly with the captain. Even though in Eoin Morgan's case, he has actually tried, it still doesn't quite work the same. And so they were Morgan's men, and he got the CBE. And when Joe Root was trying to win the World Test Championship this year, and it happened to overlap with Eoin Morgan trying to win the T20 World Cup, Eoin Morgan's plan seemed to win out over Joe Root's. I think it's fair to say to most England fans that had sat through just countless decades of boring middle overs and death spells that actually ended with someone dying, Eoin Morgan and his method was something completely different, that he was a genius of a captain. But the first half of this season, well, Kolkata were not winning and it was ugly, and fans decided that it was Morgan and that he had to go. I remember there was a guy that kept commenting on here, talking about him being a laptop captain whose battery had run flat. I don't know if he realizes that, they have chargers in the dugout. But either way, he was seen as someone who was very rigid with his plans and had made mistakes, and Kolkata were losing. I think all captains make mistakes, and he's always been quite, rigid with his plans. I think he trusts the process more than he does his instincts a lot of the time. And to be fair, he's had a lot of success as a captain, so I think that's an okay thing to do. I also think that just by him being picked brought in selection problems for Kolkata as well. But they had far bigger problems than Eoin Morgan in the first part of this season, like batting and bowling. I mean, there's plenty of talent in their batting. There really is, Shubman Gill, Rahul Tripathi, Nitesh Rana. That was their top order of the Indian players, which allowed them then to have a bunch of overseas players in the middle. That's a really good mix. Like, most teams would die for that, but Kolkata just couldn't make any runs. And if you factor in Pat Cummins, they had batting in some games all the way down to 8. Yet they were averaging 21 runs per wicket before the break. If you want to compare that to Delhi and Chennai, you really shouldn't compare that to Delhi and Chennai because they are a long way away. They batted really well, and Kolkata did not. They just kept losing wickets all the time. If you can bat to 8 and you have a decent top order and you have really strong overseas players in your middle, that should be your strength. And it was supposed to be. The problem is that the bowling was not supposed to be their strength, and the bowling was not particularly good. I've already done videos on their bowling before that you can have a look at. Low-key obsessed with their bowling. But let me just try and boil it down for this video. They don't have a new ball seamer that they trust. So they've been trying to cover that by using Varun Chakravarti bowling a lot of spin, but also they've had Harbhajan Singh, Sunil Narine, Shakib Al Hasan and Nitish Rana bowl spin. They're bowled 49% of their overs in the power play have been spin, and that's just because they don't really trust their seamers. And the problem with using that much spin in your power play is they're quite often economical, but they don't take a lot of wickets. Seamers generally take a lot more wickets in the power play. And so far, Kolkata have taken 10 wickets in 9 power plays. It's, average at best. And it's not really the seamer's fault. They're just not made for this. Maybe Shivam Mavi might be someone who in the future can be a good power play bowler, but at the moment, I don't think he's quite ready for that. He hasn't taken many wickets and he's gone it over 8 runs and over. Pat Cummins, I think people think Pat Cummins can do everything because Pat Cummins kind of looks like he can do everything, but he's not a particularly good new ball, white ball bowler. New ball, white ball? Yeah, he's not a particularly good new ball, white ball. New ball, white ball. He gets a lot better the longer they go into the innings. He's a good middle overs bowler and a really good death bowler, but at the top, he's just okay. He's certainly not someone you want to specialise there. And the other seamer that they've gone with is Prasidh Krishna, who is young and talented and looks like he could be really good. What he doesn't look like right at the moment is a power play bowler, and his numbers suggest that he is in no way a power play bowler. Kolkata have tried not to use him as much as possible so far in the first part of the season, and that's probably because they've seen his record. He's managed 4 wickets in 312 power play deliveries across his T20 career so far. It's not a lot of power play deliveries, but it's not great. And one of those 4 is Virat Kohli with a very good ball. But in that same power play that he took Virat Kohli, he also bowled a no ball and followed it up with another no ball. It just feels like things can go spectacularly wrong for him. They're just not up-front bowlers at the moment, those 3. And the annoying thing for Kolkata is, in their squad, they had Lockie Ferguson and Tim Southee, who both have far better power play records than any of the bowlers they were actually getting to bowl there. And the reason that Ferguson and Southee weren't in the team is essentially because Cummins was in the team, and there's a lot of different reasons for Cummins being in the team. One is that he was batting really well. In fact, when the season broke, he had made more runs than Eoin Morgan and Sunil Narine. If their batting was making more runs, they might have felt a little bit more comfortable leaving Cummins out, but they weren't making more runs. They didn't feel comfortable, and so they wanted Pat Cummins in the side. Now, there were other options. They could have used Andre Russell, and his full quota of overs and not just used him as a part-timer. And not only is it risky because he's probably not quite a frontline bowler at the IPL level, also it meant that they would have had to drop Cummins. There is always a problem with team dynamics when you drop the highest paid player. I know there shouldn't be. I know that's not how things should work, but you're going to have to trust me on this. When teams do that, it causes issues throughout the entire camp. Of course, they could have dropped someone else. They could have dropped Eoin Morgan. And if he wasn't the captain, I think they probably would have dropped him, right? But because he was, they were sort of anchored to Cummins and Morgan, and they kind of almost intertwined at a certain point. Morgan struggling to get runs meant that Cummins' runs were more important. If Morgan had made runs, maybe they could have let Cummins go. If Morgan was dropped from the team, maybe they could have had Cummins and Ferguson in the same team. So, in a sense, I don't really think that the tactical problems that Eoin Morgan had, and all captains make mistakes, just we seem to notice them more when their teams lose. But I don't think those mistakes specifically actually meant that he was the reason that Kolkata were losing. You'd have to say an experienced captain of his level would at least be a par captain, if not a slightly above par, even if you think you saw a couple of decisions that you disagreed with. Over a long period of time, you would think Morgan's captaincy would come out as a plus of some kind or another. But the thing is, him being in the side was not a plus for Kolkata. That's not really about him as a captain. That's really more about team design and how this happened. That's where the error was. So let's just focus on whether Eoin Morgan is a great captain or not. He won the World Cup, and so obviously that will mean to many people that he is a great captain. That's a fair assumption. All I'm going to say is, if Heath Streak was the Australian captain, and Steve Waugh was a Zimbabwe captain, and they both had the same teams outside of those two changes. Would his streak not have won a lot more games? Would he not be higher up on any sort of all-time great captaincy list than Steve Waugh was? I mean, basically, when we're talking about great captains, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, we're talking about they won a lot. And there is no great way of talking about captains outside of a win-loss record. And generally, your win-loss record has more to do with the bowling talent you have or the team that you have. Perhaps if you want to get a little bit tricky and you want to look at the advanced metrics, you could actually look at lineups and you could look at the percentage chance in each lineup of a team actually winning a game. Is this captain winning a higher percentage of games than the team looks like they should on paper? I suppose you could do that, but there's still other factors to that. I mean, how much of a win is down to a captain? They're 9% of a cricket team. They do make a lot of decisions. They certainly make a lot of decisions per ball in T20 cricket, but more or less in the field, they usually have 5 frontline bowlers, or maybe 1 part-timer or 2 part-timers if they're really lucky. The conditions, the matchups, the match situation, the toss, all these things actually play into how they use their bowlers anyway. And their bowlers have roles. You know, they can change it around a little bit, but they can't use their best death bowler to bowl 4 at the top just because on a whim, because quite often that will cause them huge problems. And when they do it, it might come back to bite them, or they might look like a genius, or they could do exactly that and they could use their best death bowler up front to bowl 4 overs. And in one game they would win, and in the next game they would lose. And they'd look like a genius, and then they'd look. And realistically, it maybe wasn't a good or a bad idea. It was just another way of using your resources. I mean, with the field, we generally know where players are going to hit now. You're bowling to specific plans, so you already have the field out. A lot of bowlers play in their own fields as well. And a lot of captaincy is, even if we don't like to admit it, is chasing the ball. He keeps hitting it there. I'm going to put someone there. When it comes to bowlers, we certainly now have algorithms that might be able to tell us the optimal bowling that we should be using for any specific over. Problem is that doesn't account for dew and loss of confidence and the pitch and all those different things. The captain has to play a role in all of that. So we can't even judge them against an algorithm because we don't know specifically what is happening out on the field at that time. That's the problem with captaincy. A lot of it is done behind closed doors. A lot of it we can't see. A lot of it we can't measure. And yet we talk about it all the time. My guess is at the professional level, there are very few terrible captains that are actively making their teams worse. And that's because generally you're an experienced player who is a good professional before you even get the job. You understand the game. You may not be great at getting the most out of all the players. You may not be a brilliant tactician, but there's generally going to be parts of the game that you are very good at, and that is going to come out. And if not, you're probably going to be a neutral captain, which doesn't really affect your team in either way. Let's think about this a little bit mathematically for a moment. In any particular game, the players are going to make up at least 90% of the reason why you win or lose before you go in, regardless of any other factors. Of the remaining 10%, you have captaincy, weather, the toss, and pitch conditions, right? You can't control all of those, where you can control captaincy a little bit better. But it does show you what a little effect captaincy actually has on a game. And quite often now, coaches make decisions within the batting order more than captains do as well, which means that has been taken away from captains, which traditionally decided on the batting order. Let me put it this way. There's been a lot of theorizing out there that when it comes to fielding, the best fielders in T20 are worth 2 to 3 runs per game at absolute most. I can't see how captaincy would be worth much more than that either. But here's the thing. I don't know. And you don't know. And we may never know. When it comes to captaincy, we're not even checking how often they move the field and where they are putting those fields and what effect that is having on the game. We don't know heaps of things when it comes to this. We don't know what the captain says to the bowler at the top of the mark. We don't know what happens on the training field. We don't know what would have happened if they tried a different tactic. We don't know what would have happened if they didn't go for that great strategy and they just kept the boring one. We just kind of get sucked in by the things that we like in captaincy, whatever that is. We all do it. But one thing I'm pretty sure, or at least I hope we all know, is that a bad captain with a great team will beat a great captain with a bad team pretty much every single time. It's just that when our team loses 2 or 3 on the trot, we tend to forget that. Ben Stokes is at the heart of 2 of Eoin Morgan's most important moments. One is obviously the World T20 final when Ben Stokes got smashed everywhere by Carlos Brathwaite. And the other one is the World Cup final where Ben Stokes helped England get into the Super Over with the help of the front and back of his bat. Let's start with that World T20 game. England started horribly. Morgan went out to bat, didn't make any runs and didn't help England at all. But Root, Butler and Willie helped them get up to a decent enough total where they were a good chance of winning that game. When England went out to bowl for the second over, Morgan opened up with Joe Root, who had actually done that quite a bit for Yorkshire. Almost half the time he's ever bowled for Yorkshire, it's been as an opening bowler in T20 cricket. He'd also opened for England before. This was probably more match-up dependent because of Chris Gale, and he did take Chris Gale. He also took Johnson Charles, and it looked like an absolute genius thing. And from that moment onwards, England were always in front of the game until basically Carlos Brathwaite's second six. If Root had bowled the exact same over, taken no wickets and gone for late 7 or 8 runs, no one would have thought about it, and yet in many ways it would have been an equally good or bad decision by him. The other big decision that Root had to make was about his seam bowlers, because he had 4 of them in the lineup and only one of them was a death over specialist, Chris Jordan. Liam Plunkett, David Willey and Ben Stokes were all in that team, and none of them were particularly good death bowlers, so it meant that he had to juggle them. Obviously Chris Jordan was going to get 2 of the overs at the death. Liam Plunkett bowled his overs out in the middle, as he often did, and David Willey got the early death over, meaning that Stokes was always going to have to bowl right towards the end. Morgan made a fairly normal decision that most captains would make. He used his better bowler, Jordan, earlier, so that he could push the chase up higher so that Ben Stokes had less pressure on him. Especially as Stokes is an all-rounder. You know, he's not even a specialist bowler, let alone a specialist death bowler. But Stokes had actually bowled pretty well at death for England in that tournament, but also more generally. Coming into that game across all T20, he bowled 199 balls at the death, and he had a bowling average of 15 and an economy of just under 8. Got to be happy with those numbers. It's not a lot of balls, but he certainly wasn't brand new, and 48 of them were for England. And in those, his economy at the death was 7.1. And I wrote about this during that tournament, that Ben Stokes had this sort of mad way of bowling quite fast, and he didn't really seem to have a plan the way that someone like Chris Jordan, who would go for Yorkers would, or other bowlers would go for slow balls. Ben Stokes just kind of bowled fast, licorice all sorts, and hoped that that would confuse people. And to be fair, most of the time it worked. But if you take away the first ball that Carlos Brathwaite hit for 6, Ben Stokes missed his Yorker 3 consecutive balls. They didn't want to bowl wide outside of stump because that was the short boundary. They didn't want to bowl short and at the body because they thought Brathwaite could hit to the leg side. Their plans made sense. Try and bowl a Yorker and make sure that he mishits one when he's trying to hit down the ground for a 6. It's just that Ben Stokes missed all of his Yorkers and Carlos Brathwaite did not. So in the 2019 World Cup final, I wouldn't say that Morgan captained badly at all. I thought he was quite good all the way through. New Zealand lost regular wickets. He kept pressure on them, and they ended up with 241, which seemed at the time around par. I mean, later it would seem to be exactly par. For a batting side like England, that was well within their chase. Morgan went out to bat and he failed, and so did most of the England batters, to be fair. Except for Ben Stokes, who played an extraordinary innings and had the most freakish buzzers we've ever seen in cricket, perhaps, and somehow won that game. Now remember, there's no way that Morgan captained better in one game than he did in the other. The World T20, everyone went, well, that's a shame. When he won the World Cup, he was given the CBE. That is how we look at captaincy. The only difference was, in one game, Ben Stokes had an absolute shocker, and in another game, he was absolutely magnificent. And realistically, if you just judge Morgan on the 3 knockout finals, you can include the Champions Trophy semi-final that they lost to Pakistan as well. You would say, he won one, but that's good. And he lost 2, maybe that's bad. They won 63% of their white ball games between the 2 World Cups, 71% of their one days within that, and they were the first one-day team to ever score at more than a run a ball for a 4-year period. Morgan clearly had a big impact on what England did. And maybe what Morgan's biggest legacy for English cricket is not the on-field captaincy. Maybe it has more to do with the way he makes players feel, the way that he backs them, the way that he uses them in certain roles, and how he brings players on, and how he builds a system of winning. That's certainly what England did better than just winning a World Cup. They didn't win a World Cup because of one game. They won a World Cup because of all the games they had won before that, the way they had changed their game. Morgan couldn't do that for Kolkata. His first season, he came on halfway through, and he had the players that he had. They then had a very short break without a mega auction before the next season, and he's now in a league that is designed to make everything equal. He doesn't have Johnny Bairstow, Ben Stokes, and Adil Rashid on the bench. They were all guys who didn't actually play for England in the 2015 World Cup. It took Eoin Morgan quite a long time to change England. It will probably take him quite a long time to change Kolkata. The difference is he won't get that time. He literally won't be around for 2 or 3 years to see them become really good, even if he sets things in place. Since 2014, Kolkata has won 52% of their games. They've been entrenched in mediocrity for a very long time now. That's not going to be changed by captaincy alone, no matter how good he is. That needs a system overhaul. But I want to talk about Eoin Morgan, the batter, for a minute. Is he in T20 cricket what you would call a top-tier batting talent? And by top tier, I really mean from an IPL perspective, is he good enough to fill the 12 to 14 specialist batting positions that IPL teams usually fill with overseas players? His international record is outstanding. And he would certainly suggest with those numbers that he is good enough. He's never been that player in the IPL though. Starting in 2010, he's played for 4 teams. He's bounced around a little bit. And his average is low. Now, those numbers are a little bit depressed by the fact that he bats at 4 and 5. So they're maybe not quite as bad as they first seem. But I did look them up compared to other IPL 4 and 5 players, and they're still low. I think it's hard to argue that at his role, he's not a slightly below average player, but someone who's played 8 seasons and 76 games in the IPL. And it is a tough position to play. Of the 35 top run scorers in this position, just over half of them are overseas players. That's where you want your overseas player to go. But that Morgan is an overseas player. And he's still lower. And when you look at him season by season, he's had 1 year where he's averaged over 30 with a bat and 1 year where he's struck at over 130. Those happen to be the same year. And I'm about to blow your mind just a little bit here. They happen to be last year. His best ever batting season was the year they gave him the captaincy. That is not a coincidence. And it makes sense that he would regress back to this normal kind of batting, because there's nothing in his game to suggest he was an outstanding IPL player before this. He just happened to have one really good season. But if you look at his overall numbers, it's hard to see how he would ever do that consistently in the IPL. Because he never has. The whole overseas IPL captaincy thing is really interesting. There are so few players that are overseas who are absolute dead set locks in their team, and they're the only ones that you can ever make the captaincy of and feel really safe with. So David Warner was the captain of the Sunrisers, and when Morgan was under pressure to lose his job, it was actually Warner who lost his. But this is David Warner. He had lost some form and they had to change the lineup. It wasn't working. And so they had to lose not only their overseas player, but their captain. But by him being captain, that just made it all so much tougher. They were lucky that they had, Kane Williamson right behind him. Not all teams have that. And if you compare Warner to Morgan, Warner is far less risky than Morgan ever was. Warner is a consistent IPL run scorer and has won a title as captain. And if you look at Kolkata's team, the locked-in player is Andre Russell. He is always going to play. Most of the overseas players were going to have to change around. Like Cummins could play in some games, you could see how Ferguson would play in others. Shakib and Sunil Narayan have already swapped over a little bit. And there are certain games where you would want Eoin Morgan in the side, and other games where Shakib or Ben Cutting might even be better off. And often overseas players aren't even left out because they're not in particularly good form. It's just because of the way that the local player system works. You have to rejig the entire team sometimes, and that means that one overseas player might be a batter, needs to go out because you need a bowler to come in. Those things happen a lot, which makes it even tougher to pick an overseas player as your captain. And if Morgan was just an overseas player in the first half of the season, he would have been, dropped. They probably would have tried Venkatesh Iyer, and that would have allowed them to have Ferguson and Cummins in the same team. Rana would have dropped down to Morgan's spot, and if you look at Rana's record, he's actually a better number 4 and 5 than he is at the top of the order. He's also a better number 4 and 5 than Morgan himself. Now, no one would have known that Iyer would have had this kind of impact, but that looks like an even better team if Iyer had failed. And without Cummins there at all, the trick has been to try and find 5 bowlers while keeping Morgan in the side. They've gone with Andre Russell bowling his full overs, which is incredibly risky as there's no real coverage for him outside of Rana, who basically almost never bowls. But that means they have lost a genuine frontline bowler, and they have to use Russell at the death, and he's not a particularly good death bowler, going at over 2 runs and over so far this tournament. Although he has taken some wickets there, but there was one large bag that he took. But by doing this, it allows them to have an extra batter in the lineup. And luckily for them, that turned out to be Iyer, so everything is coming up purple. But the bowling side is thin. They could still make this exact lineup better by dropping Morgan and bringing in probably someone like Ben Cutting or Shakib Al Hassan. Either of those could chip in for a couple of overs, and the way Morgan's batting, you wouldn't assume either of them would bat worse. He's a specialist batter, and he's averaging 14 with a strike rate of 111. Now, you would expect that to get slightly better towards the back end of the season. But that's a lot to carry from an overseas player who has never consistently been good in the IPL. And it's worth looking at just all the different reasons why Kolkata ended up with him as captain. He's an incredibly well-respected person in professional cricket and in the IPL directly, which is why he's had such a long career even though he hasn't made that many runs. It's clear that Kolkata had a crisis of leadership at that time, and they had an international captain sitting there waiting to go. And he was making runs at that time, way more than he had at any other period in his career. And there's also an emotional connection. Not only is the coach one of his closest friends, but this is Kolkata and he was there for the glory years, even if weirdly he never played in one of their actual titles. His captaincy feels like a combination of crisis, batting form, and personal connections. That basically tells you, even before he was given the job, there were already massive issues there. Even him finding form probably doesn't change things all that much. But here's what's really interesting. Kolkata have looked so much better since the resumption. Before they were a dumpster waiting for a match, really. They won 2 of 7 matches before, and they've been 3 or 4 since. And they went within a ball of beating Chennai as well, which means they would have gone 4-0 and beaten both the league leaders. And all 4 of their matches have been quite different. In the win over RCB, Prashit Krishna took one of his few power play wickets, and Ferguson took the other. Russell took wickets in the middle because Pat Cummins wasn't there to clog up those overs, and Chakravarthy also dominated that phase. And they didn't have to worry about death bowling because the game never really got there. In the win over Mumbai, they couldn't take a wicket in the power play. The Prashit gamble didn't work. Russell went for runs again, but the other 3 bowlers were incredibly tight. And for the second straight game, Venki Iyer got them off to an incredible start. The rest of the batting just kind of backed him up. In the third game against Chennai, it was the batting as a total unit that got them, well, just about enough runs. The weaker bowlers still went for runs, and Russell got injured, and Morgan had to assemble a death lineup on the fly. And in the end, Narayan almost defended 4 runs off the last over, although you could have suggested even with the short boundaries, perhaps he should have bowled the 19. And then to take on Delhi, they didn't have Andre Russell, and that meant that their batting was weaker, and during the game, Ferguson got injured, which meant their bowling was weaker. But Iyer stepped up with the ball for the second straight game after 2 good games earlier with the bat, and Rana played probably his best innings of the tournament so far, coming in at number 4. There were some good things and some bad things, but they won 3 and lost 1 and could have gone 4-0. But there are bad things, obviously. But of the bad things, maybe the baddest is Eoin Morgan, who in 3 games has made 8, 7 and 0. Realistically, it was Cummins forcing their hand with selection that made them come out so differently, as well as Brendan McCullum telling everyone to smack the ball, which is easier to do when you have one more specialist batter in the lineup. Iyer seems to have given them more batting, and weirdly, more bowling as well. This also allows them to continue to gamble with Russell's overs, even when they don't feel that comfortable with it. I still think this is a bit of a shaky 11 in different ways, but outside of Morgan's batting, it just looks very good right now. And they are winning matches, so does that make Eoin Morgan a better captain now than he was before? Did he go off and take magic leadership pills? What obviously really helped was that a broken team had a chance to have a break, regroup themselves a little bit, and come back better. The last 3 games of the season are now against teams that are below them on the table. They'll still probably finish somewhere between 4th and 6th, but 4th seems slightly more likely at the moment. And I suppose 3rd is not out of the equation. So, the first half of the season, they were terrible, and the fans were very upset. The second half of the season, they've been much better, and now they're giving themselves a real chance at the playoffs, if not even the title itself. But Morgan is still Morgan. He hasn't radically changed how he does things. Some things have broken differently, some players have found form, and they found a better lineup kind of by accident. Where their season ends will dictate how angry the fans are, as has always been the way. But weirdly, none of that has anything to do with the fact that Morgan is a good or a bad captain. His batting we have some answers on, and the answers aren't great. How much his captaincy affects Kolkata? Well, it's forever a question mark, like it is for kind of most captains.